in the Moloch child sacrifices, the sacrifice would be separated from those participating to sacrifice them for the benefits. And this was derived specifically so that they would not consider the activity of what they're doing and abandon their criminal mission. And to the extent that they acquire the knowledge and are afflicted by the sympathy, then they might seek to abandon it and take the sacrifice away from the god. And thus they deliberately put themselves in a position where they may not do so. And to this extent, the function of them ignoring it and going somewhere else is an essential aspect of that ritual. And to this extent, this does not provide any mechanisms of redeemability because they are not repenting. They are devoted to the offense and certified their position for their activities to conduct the various abuses with their blessing, and they, having removed their own ego from being capable of challenging that decision, is the full devotion in the giving them to their sin. When Pharaoh and others had conducted the rejection of letting the Israelis leave and remove the bondage of the slaves, he said that he refused time and time again until finally God corrupted his heart. And it is the same thing, that they're going away and ignoring it so that they might not have to have their souls tainted by their complete devotion, is complete corruption, is their hearts being given to the sin, is them not being able to be repenting, is the removal of their redemption. And any mechanism that God provides is for those that he has not affirmed their rejection. These delusional buffoons, such as the ones laundering their satanic activities into the intelligence community, pretends enhanced interrogation is an interrogation, when all of them are well aware that they have a scripted objective to acquire false claims for whatever predetermined activity that they would have been assigned. And thus they have a person in search of a crime, and they have an offense in search of justification. And thus the false justification by their subversions or harassments materializes their false evidence, which then actively supersedes any legitimacy. As this is a kangaroo court by the clan, it has no legal authority, which is acknowledged in the early functions of the United States, which has certified laws and policies against using it in the courts, which would have been corrupted by the contaminants. And to the existence of that function has proven its non-viability at the higher levels in order to engage in the justifications that they would assign intelligence for, making it actively subversive to the goal. It, not being qualified at the lower ends, does not qualify at the higher ends, and thus the more expensive, higher risk functions would not legally be allowed to use them. And thus, this being the normal activity, proves the subversion by the Confederate insurrectionists, who, being disqualified in every function, are only and exclusively an injury to the thing that they pretend to do, and thus hamper the services that needed to be acquired, which cannot because of their presence. And since it is the laundering of their black market contracts to do the crime and get away with it, according to the process, where they dispose of the victim under the defamation, and thus you love the criminal and you hate the victim, being the objective according to these processes from the clan activity, posturing as government. This systemically creates the weakness against the collective security against everyone in the United States as they come up with laundered policies to hyper-accelerate their anarchy against law and order, as the legal processes of the courts limiting them is not liberty from God, it then becomes the adversary and thus contemptible. And thus their kangaroo courts hyper-accelerate frauds to bypass it by clear and direct lies, such as the finality of the courts, which is not legal, as the courts exist to do due examinations and systems of appeals in order to make the corrections against these activities. And thus, since it is a parasite seeking the overthrow of the thing, it breaks down those mechanisms of security into the objective clan anarchy. And thus the criminal systems, such as the ones used for electric shock therapy, which is not functionally therapy but an extension of MK Ultra in order to engage in trauma-based mind control and other nerve hacking functions, the electric attuning of the person's DNA allows them to be tracked and thus pursued indefinitely with the non-traditional secret surveillance equipment, which being functionally connected to the capacity to engage in hacking by the attuning of the electric signal, then is able to use the electric signal to hack into the nerves, which creates the electric shock terrorism, which is designed to engage as social violence in order to manufacture their desired outcome. This layered on top of other technologies, such as their capacity of overpowering the person and replacing their activities by a second party who is conducting the function, would systematically be put through processes where they are training their terrorists for the militias of their Hitler's Youth Program type arrangements. This hyper-accelerating the threats engages in the function of the degenerating of the collective society into the arbitrary abuses necessary for its preparation to be conquered on maturity, as the hypercentralization removes the collective security function by the false sense of power. They generically create themselves to be weaker and have a false sense of power by that unearned power, making them unaware of their enfeeblements, derivative of the thing that makes them feel strong. As the deal with the devil requires them to remove their own security and be the cause of their vulnerabilities, and thus they, making themselves vulnerable, systemically remove the mechanisms of their viability in the society, and thus collapse their capability of security and survival, as they desperately create the worst injury in a fanatic claim in order to assert the security against the injury that they're causing in order to stop the other offenses which required them to engage in these defective behaviors as a function of the war by the psychological advanced warfare functions designed by the double agents who sold the country out for the Confederacy's profits to engage in the sales and distributions for the conquering of it by its enemies hyper-accelerated by its double agents, who have never actually done anything legitimate for the system outside of pure accident. These systems are designed to break the arrangement of the collective society into the mass sacrifice rituals, creating the Gnostics, which, in their arrogance, viewed themselves as capable of becoming some form of lich god as the undead rival and wreathe and mass themselves to become the superior entities amongst the world, forming the one world satanic government, is a part of their fundamental strategies and objectives. And thus the pretense generates their reduction of injuries in the direct conflict so that there are more to sacrifice, generating the higher influx of energy from the necrotic powers as they suck in from the vacuum created by the mass killings, and to this extent engage in the permanent tainting, which some have suggested is one of their ritual beliefs in the creation of the desert, such as the ones derived by their Blight's structure, which is reflected in the D&D position for the narrative of Vecna. And to this extent, this would be their belief on the creation of artificial deserts, which can be generated as a trick, as many of them have engaged in the function of creating metropolises from deserts, and to the hyper-engagement of the creation of viable ecosystems from those deserts, can then use that structure to collapse it and then return it to the desert, which is a false claim of the creation of a new desert, which is the old desert going back to normal because they broke their own system, and this toppling on itself, exponentially compounded to the system of their creation of these barren wastelands as a mechanism of their standard sacrifice ritual. As the function of killing in order to eat is not parasitical, as the hunting of prey is necessary to keep the maintenance of an ecosystem, whereas the function of a parasite creates the collapse of that ecosystem, and thus the misrepresentation of those parties, creating a system of switching subjects in order to engage in the false justification of their infinitely diverse cons, presupposes the function of their clan terrorism as a predatory function to reduce the herds of the human population, which then, by definition, is the breakdown of the system which exists for them, which then is the parasitic breakdown of their ecosystem, as opposed to the maintenance of a population. And thus, to this extent, they are engaged in the arbitrary abuses, as opposed to the natural calling of the criminal, who, engaging in legitimate offenses, can be dealt with appropriately according to the jurisdiction's decisions, which is, again, as mentioned from the beginning, counterproductive to their group, who views themselves as separate to the system, as they are predatory oppositions to any mechanism that sustains the ecosystem, as they are predatory outsider without authority. They engage in their terrorisms as a servant to the necrotic gods, and thus posture authority where they do not have authority, in order to engage in the systems of usurpation by confidence games, which then maintains their perpetual harassment campaigns, as a military function in the ritual of their own death. And this being the devotion means that they, having no actual use for the product, can ignore it in favor of their black market rituals, which then sustain them according to their sacrificial services to their demonic overlords, and to this end engage in the abandonment of the product in its entirety. And thus the function that they can just collect it later is systemically ignored in favor of the function that it was always a distraction and never relevant to their core interests, and thus was never a reason for them to do anything, as an expendable distraction that no one cares about, and thus exclusively is used as a papier-mâché distraction or disguise while they engage in their criminal behaviors as its own ends. It is important for you to investigate the differences between Yahweh and his adversary Baal, as Baal is derivative of king, lord, or owner, for the function of provisions of rain and rebirth and rejuvenation and wealth and the rest of it. To this extent, those who conduct rain dances believe that their dance creates the rain, and to that end, those who see the rain attributed to the dance, the benefits derivative of Baal, would then likewise be circumstantial, as the effects of him merely receiving phantom advantages under things that are not directly under his profile. And to that extent, the mechanism of the illusions actively dilute the deceivable, as the function of Yahweh having brought Israel to Israel had engaged in the function of his contest with Baal between their prophets, and Yahweh won, and Baal did not respond, and the rains came, which is an inevitability, and thus the mechanism of having attributed the value of that, creating the confusion, is exclusively the stupidity of those who were subordinated to this incompetent function, and thus given away into their delusions, become self-destructive, which is the inherent nature of the Confederates' wizards, as their communism derives their advantage and systemically undermines their ability to exist, as their extortionary abusive nature is its own living creature and their one true God. All of the benefits of the spoils of war, of enemies, of the nations they infect, and the nations that they infect themselves, would be derivative of their pirate-based nature and their theft-based society. Protecting against remedies would actively seek to attack anyone who would compel justice when they have clearly sought liberty from God, and thus the mechanism of their survival as a scam artist society requires them to be extraordinarily violent and subversive to the things necessary to maintain society, and thus have corrupted it. And thus you understand the nature of why they lie to it, because they need its eradication for their continued survival as a parasite function. And likewise, in our example, are self-deluded and carried away among their own delusions, willingly giving up the thing that they pursue greedily and excuse all kinds of actions for in order to acquire it, only for it to be ignored willfully as a piece of incompetence. The specific objective of the thing being ignored by the total system taking away something to hyper-exaggerate another feature means that they view the thing as something that can be removed and not really taken seriously, like a kidney. And to the extent that they believe that it is similar to a kidney, then they do not have the purification functions inherent, and thus, since they, in their drug-addled minds, are used to not having it, they ignore it until they have inevitably destroyed it wholesale. And to the extent that they've completely eradicated it wholesale, it takes them utterly by surprise when the inevitability of what they are is expressed in their consequences they were so desperate to avoid and inevitable to catch.